I'm Walt Wheeler, Executive Director of the Michigan Masonic Charitable Foundation, and we're here today recording another segment in the Legacy series, doing interviews of past Grand Masters of the Grand Lodge of Michigan. With us here today is Most Worshipful Brother Paul N. Cross, who was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge in the years 2001-2002. Paul, welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you for being with us. Let's start at the very beginning. Tell us where you were born.
I was born in Windsor, Ontario, in Canada.
So you're a Canadian, eh?
I'm a Canadian, eh?
And when were you born? When were you born?
At night. No. Born May 28, 1955.
Tell me a little bit about your mom and dad.
Well, my dad, Tom, he was actually born in Detroit of Canadian parents, and then there was some sort of complication, so my granddad was working here at the time, commuting, and they brought my grandma over to what's now Harper Hospital. At that time it was Detroit Women's Hospital, to deal with the complications because there were no medical personnel in Leamington and very few in Windsor. So it was 1929, and they came over and had him. And the day he went back to Canada after they were released from the hospital was the day the stock market crashed. So we always blamed him for that. But he grew up in Leamington, Ontario, which is now the tomato capital of Canada. His dad was a master machinist, and eventually got into the electrical and plumbing trades because my grandmother's dad was not real happy with the fact that he was in Detroit running a machine shop 5 days a week. Bear in mind there were no tunnel or bridge in those days. So he set my granddad and two of his brothers up in business. They were all master machinists except one brother who was a plumber. So machinists did their own electrical work in those days. So he set them up in the electrical and plumbing contracting business. So my dad grew up in that trade. Was trained as a machinist by his dad and his uncles, but also learned the electrical and plumbing trade. And when he was 16, he became a lineman with the Ontario Hydro, and eventually went to Queen's University in Kingston as an electrical engineering student, and was one of, I think, 25 who graduated out of an initial class when they started as freshmen of over 250. They had pretty good standards there, and the only way you could graduate at that time, you had to pass the provincial licensing exam to get your diploma. If you failed the licensing exam, you did not get your diploma. While he was in college, he met my mother. At that time, her name was Betty Amy Norman, but she didn't like that, so she went by Beth and eventually had it legally changed. But her family lived in Kingston, and she was also a student at Queen's University going for her MRS degree, what they used to call her MRS degree. And the guy that my dad was boarding with was a friend of her family, so that's how they got connected. And she was a English major, which we had to learn the language when we were kids, obviously, because she had learned the Queen's English, actually King's English in her day, and so we would too. But they eventually got married in 51, which is the same time that he joined Lodge. He turned 21. His landlord was a Mason, a past master of Queen's Lodge 578, which is the university lodge. There's 5 lodges in Kingston. One of them's actually affiliated with the university. And he ran the bookstore, so as a member of the staff, he was able to join that lodge. My dad joined based on that, and my mother's grandfather was a Mason from Barron's Point Lodge in Ingleside, Ontario. So he had some good influences to get him involved. He went to work again for the Ontario Hydro as a line crew supervisor. They were in the process at that time of changing the electrical system in southwestern Ontario from 25 cycles to 60 cycles, if I recall the stories correctly. But he joined the Navy. He wanted to be in the Navy. He'd always wanted to be in the military. He liked the Navy. He liked the stories. So he went down to the recruiting office and he applied to join the Navy. He was a regular, what they now call a decade, a seaman. And he took the test and they found out that he was a college graduate with a professional license. So he qualified for direct commission as an electrical officer. So he was directly commissioned in 1956. I was a whole year old. And went from there. But he was always very proud of the Navy. But he was very busy with the Navy and never got active in the Lodge in Canada. Even though when we lived in Windsor, the Naval Training Station where he was senior training officer is right next door to the Masonic Temple. But we never knew that as a Masonic Temple. We knew that as the Dancing Friday Nights building, and we spent a lot of time at the ship cleaning the floors, and we're down in the range shooting. They had Lee Enfield 303s that had been converted to 22s for training purposes. We used to shoot the guns there. We just had really good times at the ship.
How long was he in the Navy?
He retired in 1972. I think it was 17 years total, which was the minimum for retirement. Got his Canadian Defence Medal, which is kind of a big deal. Of course, in the British military, you get any commendation like that, it's part of your name for the rest of your life. So he's always very proud of being a CD. But if anybody asked him, you knew my dad. You never talked too much about stuff like that. He didn't thump his own drum. Anybody asked him, he said, for 15 years of undetected crime.
Your dad had a very interesting encounter with the Queen. Tell us
he
about
did.
that.
In 1959, they officially opened what's now known as the St. Lawrence Seaway. Way back when my great-granddad was running his ship on Lake Ontario, you couldn't get from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie until the Welland Canal went through in the 30s. So they opened up what's now the St. Lawrence Seaway, and you could get from the Atlantic Ocean all the way through all 5 Great Lakes, all the way over to Duluth if you wanted to. And it was a big deal. So Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip and their entourage came over. And of course they have to be formally received. And the commander of that reception party was my father, and I've got a picture of him saluting Queen Elizabeth, who was like 26, and Prince Philip at Windsor. And they had all the ceremonies, the formal ceremonies, and then he was invited aboard the Royal Yacht for lunch and later for dinner. So he's had lunch and dinner with the Queen. And I've got the beer mugs and the swizzle sticks to prove it.
And that was when before Canada was independent.
This is 1959. Canada was a self-governing dominion. We had only had Canadian citizenship since 1946. Before that, you were simply a British subject. The Canadian Navy was essentially a semi-autonomous branch of the Royal Navy. The uniforms, all his uniforms he got from Jeeves in Portsmouth, England. His sword from Portsmouth, England, but you had a little rocker on the sleeve that said Canada in bullion. So, and he was always very proud of that.
I know that you have a brother. Tell us a little bit about your brother.
My brother David is a little more than a year and a half older than I am. He was born in Chatham, Ontario, before they moved to, we were living in Riverside when I was born, which is just up the way and is now actually part of Windsor. But Dave is, he's a pretty neat fella. He's always been interested in animals. And started working, his first job was working at Gassau Veterinary, and he worked his way up from cleaning cages to a veterinary assistant. And got his degree from MSU in vertebrate zoology, and wound up working at some lab out in the Grand Rapids area, testing mice or something, whatever they do in the labs. Nothing horribly exciting. So he went and became a graduate farrier and started shoeing horses for a living. And he just really enjoyed that, but doesn't always pay well. So he went back to school, and he got 2 master's degrees, and I can't remember exactly what they are, animal-related things. Then he got a doctorate in large animal reproductive physiology, which he enjoys and makes no sense to me. But he got working at what's now Harry S. Truman University as a professor of animal sciences. I think he actually was in the equine sciences. He likes horses. And he also ran a horse farm, and he ran the horse breeding program there. Decided he really still wanted to be a vet, so he left there and he went back to school at the University of Missouri-Columbia, got his DVM, came back to work in the Kalamazoo area, got run over by a herd of cattle, near killed, and decided he better get a rodeo vest. Well, they wouldn't let him go to work with a rodeo vest. Rodeo vest is like an armored vest that the rodeo riders wear so that they don't get a flailed chest, which is what he got when he got run over by 6 cows who used him as a soccer ball. So he wound up leaving there, and he went back and got a job as a professor, assistant professor, associate professor, whatever they are, at University of Missouri-Columbia, where he had graduated from teaching. He was a clinical professor of equine science, or veterinary, whatever. After my dad died, he came up and he bought out an ambulatory equine practice over in the west side of the state. And unfortunately, that pretty well coincided with a change in federal horse slaughter laws. So guys who had horses, instead of slaughtering the horse and getting a new one and taking care of it, would put it in the back field, let it go fallow until it had to be put down, and then they didn't buy a new horse. So let's say the business literally died. And he went back to University of Missouri-Columbia, and he's there now as an associate professor or assistant, whatever it is, I think he's in charge of the small animal anatomy program, is what he's doing down there.
Okay.
He never did join Lodge. When I was in the service, my 2 grandmothers died about 6 weeks apart, and my mother's mother had been very active in the women's Masonic organizations in Canada. And that kind of sparked my dad's interest again, and unfortunately my brother was the one receiving on that, because my dad never talked to us about Masonry. It's not allowed in Canada, but my mother had no such injunctions. And by the time I got out of the service 2 years later, he wasn't joining anything. So he never has joined anything.
So tell us about some childhood memories growing up in Canada.
Growing up in Canada, we played baseball. We didn't play softball. We didn't play t-ball. We played baseball forever. I don't remember ever playing any ball game other than regular hardball. The girls played softball, the boys played hardball, and I don't remember ever seeing boys play softball until I moved to the States. We learned to skate about the time you learned to walk. We had stamped out 4-bladed ice skates, and they clamped on your shoes like roller skates used to. So you started learning to skate about the time you started learning to walk. And you always built your own rink in the backyard, and you played hockey all winter long. We spent a lot of time at the ship, cleaning the floors, cleaning the brass work. Usually some leading seaman, who's known as a killer over there, had charge of us, or some old chief who my dad was mad at him or happy with him. I never was sure which. But we had good times growing up in Riverside first, and then we moved to Windsor in '61. And just had really good times. In fact, went to school, you know, JJ from Prince Hall?
I don't think so.
Jimmy Jessup, past Grand Master.
Oh, sure, I do. Yes, I do.
Jimmy Jessup and my brother were in the same class in grade school in Windsor.
Okay.
And we just had really good times. I mean, we played baseball in the summertime. We played hockey all winter. We'd go ice fishing. and you play hockey with the chunks of ice you dig out. While you're waiting for a fish to bite, you play hockey, keep warm. And you play hockey with the chunks of ice, and you try and get them down the other guy's fishing hole. We just did all kinds of stuff. We'd go every summer. When my parents went on vacation, we went to my grandparents in Leamington. Well, my grandparents ran the business, so and it's pretty active business. So we would usually Monday morning get dropped off at Cousin George's farm and picked up Friday night. So we'd spend the week working the farm. We learned to milk cows, take care of the goats, feed the cows, feed the pigs, get the eggs from the chickens, which is a lot harder than it sounds because they don't like that and they peck at you. Catching the piglets for dinner and trying to avoid Mama while you're doing it because Mama can hurt you. They had a tree house there. We got to play on the tractors. We had a really good time. George had a lot of cornfields. It was his cash crop, and then the cows and the pigs and the chickens and the goats were subsistence stock. We had really good times there. We'd go fishing on the Leamington piers, on the Leamington docks. My granddad would take us out fishing there, and it was perch fishing. And it was shoulder to shoulder fishing. I mean, 9 times out of 10 you caught the next guy's line too, but we got some great big perch there. They were huge. And he'd take us out to the boardwalk in Point Pelee, the federal park there. And we'd spend a lot of time walking the boardwalk through Point Pelee. And he taught us to fish. There's the canoe livery is right there where you start the boardwalk, and he would teach us to fish with a piece of string and a bent pin. And just catch the little bluegills and snatch them up. They had to throw them right back because it's a national preserve. But you just reach and catch them a little bit and pull them up. And we had really good times with my granddad. And he died rather unexpectedly when I was 10. And that was a really hard day. That was a bad day.
Well, let's go back to your childhood. Tell us where you went to school.
I started out at Princess Elizabeth School in Riverside, which was kind of cool because you had to cross a 6-lane divided highway to get there. And I'm 5 and my brother's 6, and we're crossing this big highway by ourselves. That was pretty cool. We used to play marbles behind school, after school, and we had a railroad track going right through the backfield of the school. I went there just for kindergarten and first grade. And then right at the end of the school year, we moved to Windsor, and they moved during the day while we were in school. So my brother and I walked home from school to the house where there was a cab waiting for us. We got the cab and went to the new house in Windsor, right just off of downtown, right Erie and Victoria, just off Erie and Roulette. So it's literally a stone's throw from the Masonic Temple in Windsor. And we lived there until '66, and it was great because we had the run of the city. We'd walk from there up to Jackson Park and walk all through Jackson Park. We were living there, like I said, from '61 on. They made Dieppe Park down on the riverfront that used to be a railroad head down there. It was for the railroad ferry along the riverfront right at downtown Windsor. And they tore all that out, and they made a park down there, and they named it Dieppe Park in honor of the Dieppe raid in 1942 in France, which was conducted. Almost all of the troops involved came from Essex County, Ontario, which is where Windsor's at. So they named it in honor of that, and of course it has to be done with a military detail because it's named for the military. So my dad was in charge of that too. So we're down there, and they fire the big, all the volleys and all that stuff. They do the memorial. My dad grabbed, I will call him the old man. We always call my dad the old man. Never my old man, the old man, which is what you call a captain of a British ship. So he thought it was cool. So he goes and he grabs some of these cartridges that they just fired, and he comes over and he gives them to my brother and I, forgetting that we're barehanded and he's wearing leather gloves. But we kind of burn our hands on those. But a little while after that, they brought an old steam locomotive down and dropped it there to put on display. It's still there. And my granddad came down and showed us how to work it, because his apprenticeship as a machinist was done with Canadian railroads. And that's what he learned to build and repair as a machinist apprentice, was these same steam engines that are now on display in Dieppe Park. So he came down and showed us how everything worked, what the firebox was, how everything did. That was cool days of my granddad.
So you said you moved to Michigan in 1966.
June of 1st, 66.
So what brought you here, and when you came here, where did you live, and then where did you go to school once you got over here?
What brought us here was a 1962 Ford Falcon station wagon. The Canadian dollar was a lot stronger than the American dollar at the time, and my dad in 1957 had gotten a job at Detroit Edison as an engineer. Interestingly enough, because the Ontario Hydro, which is a government utility, would not give him time off for the Navy. But Detroit Edison, a private utility in a foreign country, would. So he went with Edison so that he could get his military leave time to be active with the Naval Reserve. By 1966, the Canadian dollar was strong enough that for him to come back to Canada, he was losing 10% of his wages to convert the American dollars to Canadian. And my mother had wanted to be an American since the day she watched Franklin Delano Roosevelt cut the ribbon on the Thousand Islands Bridge, which is right near where she grew up. So she was pushing for it, and the economic factors were pushing for it. So he wasn't happy leaving because of the Navy. He had to go on the inactive list for a few years, but we moved over to Southfield. And I always like to tell people a very long, involved story that I won't get into here about how we moved north across the river to America. And very few people understand that directly south of Detroit, across the river, is Canada. So I get a lot of fun with that. But that was basically the reason. We came over here. It was not quite the end of the school year. There was a month of school left in Canada, but only 14 days here, so we were a little surprised at that. I basically spent the summer meeting new people. I've never reconnected with any of the guys from Windsor. Basically, it was, no, make new friends here, so we didn't write to them or anything else. We totally lost track of them. And didn't quite fit in over here, to be honest with you. Spoke different. Wrote different, because the written language is different also, and never quite fit in over here. So,
where'd you go to school?
Over here, I went to, started out at Bernie, what's now a middle school, then was junior high school in Southfield, and then went to Southfield Lathrup High School, which is a brand new school. I was the 4th graduating class. I was the first class that went all the way through all 4 grades at Southfield Lathrup.
Were you active in any activities in school, sports, band, anything like that?
In junior high school, I was in the band. I played trombone in those days. I was first chair, first trombone. When, excuse me, when we went to high school, they didn't have a band yet. They had a marching band. I didn't like the marching band. I played in the orchestra. And they didn't have an orchestra, so I didn't join the band there. Didn't get involved in football because of my size. They wanted me to hurt people, and I didn't play football that way. I mean, I liked football. I played football. Had even gotten used to American football, which is a little different than Canadian. But, and yes, I'll admit, playing sandlot football, I hurt people, but never intentionally. I hurt them because it's so big.
For the benefit of our viewers, since you're sitting down, you're 6'5"?
I'm 6'5", and right now I weigh about 300. In those days, well, in high school I weighed about 280, mostly muscle, not a whole lot of fat in those days. That's kind of reversed itself. But, yeah, I was a big fella, and they wanted me to clothesline people and other dirty loads, which I just don't do. I wanted to, I was invited to the swim team and I was going to join it, but I couldn't afford the time off work. I'd been working since I was 11 and I couldn't afford not to.
So after high school, you went into the military?
After high school, actually, I went to a year of college in a little place in southern Illinois called Blackburn. 500 students. With the college and the staff, the whole town had 5,000 people. Went there for a year, got out of there, started working at a department store called EJ Corvettes, and worked there with a buddy of mine from high school. And this is how I met Jan. Oh, I never told you my, did I tell you my mother's name? I did, Betty Ingram, okay. I know you were worried about that. I met Jan, who was my buddy's cousin, working at Corvettes. I was working, her cousin and I worked in sporting goods. I was the bike mechanic and he was a salesman. And she worked as a matron in the women's fitting rooms. And we had a guy that worked security that thought he was God's gift to women, but the women never ever agreed. But he would kind of pester them, and he was pestering her. And my buddy said, hey, you know, my cousin works up there, and I won't say the name, is pestering her. You know how he gets. I said, yeah. He says, would you do me a favor and ask her out so that she can say that, no, I'm going out with Paul, because he's scared to death of you because you're a giant and he's not. So I asked her out so that she could kind of give him the brush off, and 39 years later, right?
The rest is history, huh?
We, you know, you're at an age where you're looking for something to do. I'd gotten my 1 year of college, but I couldn't afford to do any more at that point. So I joined the service, and I looked at Navy, obviously, first, because I'd grown up Navy, and I understood the Navy. Even though they're a little different, it's still Navy. And we were looking at getting married, and they were talking, well, Vietnam had just ended. I mean, just ended. And, well, you know, you'll be afloat for 6 months, and then you'll be, you know, in port for like 6 weeks, but in those 6 weeks you'll be at sea 5 days out of 7. And I thought, that's not a good way to start a marriage. So we looked around, never heard of the Coast Guard. Coast Guard did not advertise in those days because they had enough guys that knew it and could avoid the draft that way. So I didn't know about the Coast Guard, which would have been ideal. So I joined the Army. You could pick your division in those days, so I picked the 101st Airborne Division. I did my boot camp in Louisiana at Fort Polk. We're planning on getting married between AIT and permanent party. You get about 2 weeks leave.
What's AIT?
AIT is Advanced Individual Training. It's where you train for your specialty. My specialty was combat infantry, which is basically just an extension of boot camp. So you did boot camp, and when I first got to boot camp, it turned out that my first drill sergeant had a father and brother who served under my father in the Canadian Forces. So I paid for that heavily. So at the end of boot camp, you come home, you go into AIT. About 3/4 of the way through AIT for infantry, you have what's called turning blue. And turning blue is where you're now qualified as an infantryman. You can wear the shoulder and you get the little blue discs behind your collar dogs. And you get a longer weekend leave. I used that. I went home. My grandma was dying at the time. And her first love died in the First World War. And she wanted to see me in uniform. She was always very proud of that. So I went in uniform to Canada, to visit, which I don't think you could do nowadays, to visit my grandma in hospital, and then back to Louisiana. And before AIT ended, she had died. This is another fun story of my dad. So I get the call from the Red Cross, call your dad. I call my dad, he tells me what's going on. So he tells me what to do. You want to go to your drill sergeant, you want to get emergency leave, So I go to my drill sergeant, who, not the first one I had. And this guy was a little fella who just really liked to go at you like a little rooster. And I went and I told him that my grandmother died. My dad told me I should request emergency leave. And he looked at me and he said, "That's all." We went nose to navel on this, as I like to say. He says, "That sounds like a personal problem, boy." I said, "Okay. I'd grown up with the military. I understand how it works." Saigon had just fallen. Things were in a tizzy. So I go back to the phone banks and I call my dad and I said, "Can't get leave. I'll see you 3 more days." You know, we're almost at the end. About 2 hours later, I get summoned to the first sergeant's office. Training company, all we had was drill sergeants that we ever saw. So I figure I've done something horribly offensive to someone, because you don't get called in to see the first sergeant in a training company. So I go in there, and here's my drill sergeant standing right next to me. And he's a little bitty fellow. And I am absolutely scared to death. And he looks at me and he says, "Do you know a Major Cross in Canadian Defence Forces?" I says, "I know a Lieutenant Commander Cross in the Royal Canadian Navy." He really doesn't like being called Major, because they had unified the forces by then. Everybody went by Army, right? He says, "Well," and I says, "Yes, he's my father." He says, "Are you aware his mother died?" I says, "I am." "And have you done anything about this?" And "Well, I informed Drill Sergeant Richardson," and Drill Sergeant, "Well, what did Drill Sergeant Richardson say?" He said, "He told me it was a personal problem. And I called my dad and said I couldn't get back. I'd see him when AIT's done and I get home on leave." And he looked at her and said, "Is this true?" Richardson says, "Yes, First Sergeant." He looks at me and he says, "Go pack your duffel bag and get your AWOL bag out of storage." AWOL bag's your little civilian bag you take down there to begin with. And he looks at Richard and says, "You will call him a cab and you'll pay for it." Well, the airport was in Shreveport. We're down in Leesville. It's 60 miles. And it was a $60 cab fare in 1975. And he made him pay it. I was gone in about an hour on the way back. I already had the ticket, had to pick up the ticket at the airport, and got home and over there in time for the funeral for my grandma. But that was interesting. Then we got married August 9th that year, and left the next day for Kentucky, because I had to get down there and get checked into the division down there. And we borrowed her dad's truck, put as much of our stuff in it as we could, went down to Kentucky, found an apartment, put all that stuff in there, drove back to Michigan, got I think her dad came down with us that time with a U-Haul trailer, and we got our car and went back to Kentucky. And I had to report the day after that. So we made 2 trips down and 1 trip back in the space of 2.5 days. Long couple of days.
Long drive, yep.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Jan, and you guys got married. I know you have 2 sons.
I have 2 sons, Brandon
tell us about
and
your
Sean.
kids. Okay.
Came home on leave for Thanksgiving in 1975, and apparently that's where Brandon came from. We assume, because it's almost exactly 9 months later he was born. And so he gets to always say he was born in USAH FTCKY, which is United States Army Hospital, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And so he was born. We had to get a new apartment. We were in a shotgun apartment to begin with. Shotgun apartments where it's real small and long and narrow, and you open all the doors, you can fire a shotgun through the front door and not hit anything till the shot passes out the back door. We got a new flat downtown in an old mansion that had been subdivided into 4 flats, and that was a really nice place. That was great. But it was 2nd floor, So she's climbing this outside open iron staircase, crazy pregnant. So that was in it, but it was much better flat. And I was, we did several deployments that year. We were supposed to go, the division was going on a return of forces to Germany operation. And they were supposed to leave the same day she's due, but she's quite sick. So I talked to my captain and explained to him what the deal was, and he went through change, but he couldn't get the okay from up the chain. So without any of us knowing about it, my mother went to Bill Broomfield, who was our state representative and also a member of my lodge, I found out years later. And next thing I know, I'm excused from Reforger 76, which really, I mean, it's nice to stay home for her and everything, but they come back looking funny at you because you didn't go. But earlier that year, I had been to Alaska for 6 weeks on a mission up there involving the pipeline. And later on that year, we went to Panama on a mission involving the canal, and we got our jungle expert training while we were down there. And I kind of enjoyed the Army. I really did. We wound up, though, with a colonel who decided that the enlisted men didn't need to be resupplied. It was good training. Not to well, we're airborne troops, You typically fight behind lines. You don't always get resupplied, so that was fine, except that the officers were getting resupplied. We were getting no food and no water, but the officers are eating hot rats plus sea rations, and they're getting water all the time, and we're getting nothing. And that's bad for morale. But the problem was we'd go to the field unannounced, and the wives would start calling in when we didn't get home. And the CQ, the charge of quarters, basically the security for the barracks, was not allowed to tell them that we were in the field. And it really created problems. So we wound up getting out a little earlier than we would have hoped to, but that's what happened.
So your boys...
Sean was born almost 9 months after that.
Your one son followed suit, and I know he's in the United States Coast Guard, just became a Master Chief, I think?
My youngest boy is currently a Senior Chief in the Coast Guard. He's the Station Commander, the officer in charge at Ludington Station in Michigan. My oldest boy is a Paramedic Supervisor with Alliance Medical in Southeast Michigan. Brandon's the oldest boy. He married Kathleen the year I was Grand Master, as a matter of fact. And he's got 3 girls, 5 through 10. And Sean has 1 and 9/10 or better. He's got a son, Colin, and the next one's due any moment.
All right, very good.
I should name the other granddaughters because I'll be in trouble otherwise. The oldest one is Riley, and then Jocelyn, and then Megan. So,
very good.
And they all like to go fishing with their grandpa.
I'll bet they do. So let's go back to your working life. Tell us about your very first job.
Shortly after we moved to the States, I got a paper route with the Detroit Free Press, which, believe me, is a work. They don't do kids anymore. But in those days, it was about a 4 o'clock wake up, so you could sit on the front porch and wait for the district guy to come by and drop your papers. Then you had to fold all the papers. You had to fold them the right way so they didn't fall apart. And we didn't have plastic bags if it rained or any of that stuff in those days. We did get rubber bands, so eventually you could rubber band them instead of doing the tricky fold. But I had 135 people on my route. So most of the time it was on my bike, and I delivered my 135 papers, and then just about every night I had to go out collecting because everybody seemed to think they didn't actually have to pay for it. So it was way more work than I was getting paid for, and when I finally gave that route up 3 years later, I think I was in arrears $100 and some, which is big money in those days. In the meantime, while working the Free Press route, I also had a Detroit News route, a Southfield Observer route, and one of the giveaway papers that you just deliver and you get paid, you don't have to collect. So I was very busy for those 3 years, and I finally, when I was 14, a buddy of mine from junior high school, his dad had a friend who owned a local deli. And he says, I'm going there to get a job. Why don't you come with me? Maybe we can both get a job. So I went down there and I got a job as a pearl diver, which nobody knows anymore. That's a dishwasher. So I spent the next 2 years washing dishes 30 hours a week. And none of this with a work permit. Didn't know anything about work permits. We didn't understand that was a rule over here. So I never worked under a work permit. I just worked. After 2 years there, I moved up to the big times because I was making, at that time, minimum wage for restaurants was $1.35. I hate to tell you now, it's less than double that. They still don't make much. But I got a job pumping gasoline at 12 Mile and Telegraph at the mobile station and made all of $1.65 an hour there. That was good money there. And I was doing that 40 hours a week from the time I was 16 on. Now, I did not own a car. I walked. It was 2.5, 2 3/4 miles from the house to the gas station, a little over 3 miles from the gas station to school, and then around 2 miles from school back to the house.
Now, you're not going to tell us it was uphill both ways, are you?
It was a lot of up and downhill. You drive 12 Mile on Telegraph, you'll see what I mean. And I walked it with all my books every day because I was working full-time at the gas station at midnights.
So what did you progress to from that?
I left that at the end of high school, and I got a job working for Toys R Us. And they found out that I knew something about bicycles, so they put me assembling bicycles come Christmas time. And, no, because I wasn't there at Christmas. I was there in the summertime. Something, they had a big sale on bikes. Maybe it was just start of summer. So they had me assembling bikes because I could work my way around bikes. And at the end of the summer, that's when I started college in Illinois. Came back from that, got a job at Corvettes until I went in the service. But when Corvettes found out that I was assembling bicycles at Toys R Us, they decided I must be world's best bike mechanic, and that's how I got the job being a bike mechanic at Corvettes, which was nice because I didn't have to deal with people, which is not my strong suit. And I got to stay up in my little loft in the back and keep my fingers greasy and work on bikes all day. And I just was happy.
So after you got back from the military, what did you do to
Well, I went back to Corvettes because I left on military leave, and they weren't too very happy with that. A lot of companies don't like the military leave provisions. So they wouldn't put me back in sporting goods because they really didn't want me back at all, so they put me in little girls' clothes. They thought maybe selling little girls' underwear and stuff would drive a big tough guy like me. You know, I'm a 6.5 foot tall airborne trooper. You know, we never jumped. We were what they call wop-wop warriors. We flew helicopters. But you know, I was a machine gunner, you know, for most of that time. So, well, he'll never deal with selling little girls' clothes. Well, guess what? It's a job. I got a wife and a kid and a half to support here. But I didn't end run on them because security is outside of the normal chain of command in the stores. And they liked me for security. Before I went into service, I always helped them when they had a fight or something going down. I always helped them out. So I got hired in security and became a store detective and worked that. Eventually transferred to another store and wound up getting out of that and getting into construction as a side, you know, with one of the guys that had his own little construction company. and finally got a job in regular heavy commercial construction as a laborer. And I worked a lot of different jobs. Worked on Kmart's headquarters, building now called City Center in Troy, but it was the Volkswagen North American headquarters at that time. We were building it for. I worked on the Joe Louis Arena. I worked on a lot of fairly good-sized projects.
So I know that you spent a large part of your working career as a police officer. How did you get into that line of work?
I was working construction. I was already in Lodge. I joined Lodge. We'll go back and touch on that since it's kind of pertinent. When I got out of the Army, my dad was now active over here. He had taken a dual membership in Berkley Lodge. He never did give up his mother lodge in Canada. And my mother's just hammering me, you got to join the Masons, you got to join the Masons. What the heck are the Masons? Well, your father's a Mason. Oh, okay, well, yeah. And she tells me, my dad's a Mason. The captain was a Mason. My great-granddad was a ship's captain. He was a Mason. All these, and Grandma was active in all these other organizations, all this other stuff. And my dad's dad never was a Mason, but he was favorable towards the organization and all that stuff. And my dad wouldn't talk about it because in Canada you don't. And you didn't have the internet in 1990s. So I joined on the basis of if my father was a Mason and the captain was a Mason, anything that was treason or anything immoral or anything like that. It had to be at least decent people because I know those two guys and they wouldn't be involved. And Mr. Bradburn, my dad's landlord, I knew Brad's. If he's involved, all these guys I knew that now I'm finding out I'll join simply on the strength of it can't be a bad organization if these guys are involved. And I joined Lodge, and there was a guy there that was my granddad, my dad's generation. And I'd been very close with my Grandpa Cross. And the thing that impressed me and kept me coming back was I could sit in Lodge with this man who was born at the turn of the century as a young kid. And he was Bill and I was Paul. And we talked like just regular folk. He never talked down to me. I never had to, defer to him as some, great high holy thing. He was Bill and I was Paul. And that's why I kept coming back to Lodge. But back to the other question.
That led to the police work.
Police work. So I'm in Lodge and I'm a steward. And one of the other stewards is Bruce Carlo. And the problem with the construction industry, especially as a laborer, is you might work for a week and get laid off for a week. So it's kind of hit or miss. And I was working fairly steady, but then you get an hour's notice that you're being laid off. That's it. And then you got to hang around a union hall until they get tired of you hanging around a union hall and they give you the next ticket that comes up. So I'm looking for something a little more steady. In the meantime, I'm back in school for my history degree. I was going to Wayne State at that time. Well, Bruce is a public safety officer with Oak Park. A public safety officer is police and fire combined. Everybody on the department is both fully certified, fully sworn. Oh, hey, we're hiring. Oh, really? Got a little experience in security. I'll come down and take the test. So I went down, I took the test. And, it's a fairly drawn out procedure, but out of something like 1,800 applicants, I got hired. There were only 4 of us got hired out of that whole crew, and I was one of them. And so that's how I got into police work, and it was a very interesting job.
How long were you a police officer?
I was on the street for 41 days short of 10 years when I was disabled. My dad had taught me that you do the job. This is the naval philosophy. If to save the ship or do the job, you have to sacrifice yourself, that's what you do because you have to save the ship and you have to do the job. So I was the one that ran in where angels feared to tread, and I did all the stuff that everybody else says, I'm not sure I want to go in there, but somebody's got to go in there. So I would go in there. And I got hurt a lot. In 81, I got dragged 110 feet down 8 Mile and run over by a Dodge Tradesman van. The fact that I fit underneath the Dodge Tradesman van is a testimony to the fact that I was a little slimmer in those days. But I got my skull crushed and I got my back dislocated, which caught up with me years later. But I would do these things, and I would go in and I would get hurt. I was on a rooftop in 1989 checking on a B&E and trying to get the kid who was actually just chasing tennis balls off the roof. I was half-stepping through a puddle on the rubber roof when I slipped in it and wound up bending my knee 90 degrees to the side and then twisting it around. So I wound up sitting on my foot. And then when the guys got there, because the EMTs and fire responders are all the same guys on my shift, and training tends to go out the window when it's your own people. And instead of tying my ankle to my hip, they straightened my leg out, and that's what caused a permanent disability. So they retired me. They transferred me into engineering while I fought for my pension. If I'm retired, I'm retired, and I shouldn't be working for 30% of what I used to be making, you know. But I wound up back in school. In the meantime, I'd gotten a degree in police science, but they sent me back to school. I got another degree in engineering technology, and which basically is useless because with the knee, I can't really do any of that work. But I wound up, after I got done with that, I opened up my own PI firm and did mostly traffic accidents and investigations, eventually reconstructions, and some other stuff that came along with it. I did that until my back finally failed in 2010 completely, and I can't really do anything like that anymore. So.
I know that you love to fish, and you mentioned you've been doing that since you were a little kid. Any other sports you like to participate in?
Not much anymore.
I know you golf a little bit.
I play at golf. It's a little interesting because I can't really twist my back to do it, so it's just the arms, but I still manage to punch it out about 200 yards. I do try. I haven't really ridden my bike more than once since my back went out, but I'm hoping to be able to get back to that. I got to remember to wear my brace and be careful and stuff like that. But
I know you have some hobbies. I know you're very good at leatherwork. I've seen some of your work. How did you get into that?
When I got out of the Army, Jan's cousin, who of course had introduced me to her to begin with, I was looking for stuff to keep busy while I'm not working, and just busy work type stuff. I like building things and breaking things and building things. He was doing this leather work. He'd gotten into it about a year before, so we went down to a leather shop on 7 Mile Woodward, and I looked around. They had the beginner kit, you know. So I bought the beginner kit and took it home. And how do I figure this out? You read the book, you know. I like to read. So I read the book, and I'd play with the little pieces of leather they give you in the kit. And then, okay, well, that worked. And eventually I figured it out. I never took a single lesson. I've been doing that now since '77. When I was in the police department, I did a lot of police leathers. When the city went from the little small radios, the Motorola 200s, to the Motorola 500s, it was a big radio, like carrying a brick, and we needed new radio cases, and they put it out for bid. So I bid on it. Now, the regular radio cases you get from the companies were essentially black cardboard with a plastic finish, and they didn't hold up very well. I made mine out of 10-ounce cowhide, and because the backs on them normally they're riveted up here and they snap down here, and it's just like this. You get in a fight, the guy can pull your radio case right off your belt, and we had that happen a couple of times. So I developed a system where it came off the back of the case up like this and snapped in this way, and then this was riveted down the same place. You could pull that all day long. It pulls it out this way. It can't come apart. And it took me a while to develop that. And I see that. I should have patented it because it's on all the modern radio cases and never been seen before that. But I got the contract to make the radio cases. And we made them for $25 a piece, which was nothing. And Jan and I and the two boys sat around sewing those things together by hand for weeks. I did a lot of holsters. I did notepads, the pocket notepad, so that your little spiral notebook is protected while you're working. I did a lot of belts.
Apron cases. I've seen your
Masonic I did a briefcase for my dad in those days. I also did a lot of wall hangings. We worked a rotating shift. You worked 7 days and rotated, so you never slept well. I couldn't sleep one night, and I just got a new letter magazine that had a pattern for a bighorn sheep. So I went down to the basement and I carved the bighorn sheep that night. And it's about 12 inches square, and it's just the head, so it's pretty big. But if you use the hair blades that they sell you, it's all parallel lines and it doesn't look right. So I put a glover's needle in a pin vise, and I cut every one of the thousands of hairs on that sheep's head by hand with a single blade over 3 days. And I still have that. I love that. I never could sell it. No one would ever buy it. And I've still got that. So there's a lot of that, and I tried to do some Masonic stuff, ritual covers and that, but there wasn't a big market. And then probably 10 years ago, a guy put a note out on the old bulletin board, email bulletin board thing, looking for, is there anybody that still does Masonic letterwork? Well, yeah, what are you looking for? And he's looking for ritual covers. So I did his, and then I got looking at other stuff, and I made myself an apron case. Well, actually, I had it more than 10 years ago. I made my apron case almost 20 years ago. I made my leather apron case, and then I made a leather apron case for one of the BGP guys. And then Bob Osborne had me do a hat box for his 33rd degree hat, and then Doug Hagee had me do one of those. And I just, once you make the pattern, you never ever throw it away. You refine it, but you never ever get rid of it. So I started making these patterns just in anticipation, and now I've done quite a number of apron case covers, as you've seen. I do a fair number of Scottish Rite hat boxes. I do some top hat boxes. That's most of what I do now is those apron cases and hat boxes.
I have one of your hat boxes. They're excellent. I know you're also a bit of a history buff.
Just a wee bit.
How did you get into that? Why history? What intrigued you about that?
My dad's war was World War II. He was too young to get into it. But in Canada, it's big news. Remember, Canada got involved in the war in August of 1939. All the older kids went to the war. My dad was just young enough he didn't get involved. A lot of my grandfather's friends got involved in the war, so my dad knew them. And basically, every military-age person in his town, which was not that big a town, was involved in the war, and all the kids, he was very big in the band. He was a medalist in the local band. Every Canadian town's got a brass band. And he knew all these kids from all over the county, and all the older ones are gone to war, so it was of interest. And particularly Essex County was hit very hard in the Dieppe raid, where casualties were almost total, casualties being killed, wounded, and missing. Everybody who didn't get killed or wounded basically got taken prisoner. So it hit Essex County. They say there wasn't a household in Essex County that was not affected by that raid. And so this piqued his interest. So he always had books about war, especially with the Navy, you know. He's doing the naval histories of World War II, and I would read his books. I started reading history books when I was just a little guy, and I found it interesting. And shortly after we moved over to the States, he bought an abridged copy of Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, and I still have it, even where the dog chewed the corner off of it. And I read that book from cover to cover in about a month, and it's one of those great big thick things. Fell in love with the American Civil War and started studying that. I wound up in a reenactment organization while I was in high school. In fact, I was a founding member of the 17th Michigan, which still exists. Got very heavily involved in the Civil War, but studying one war like that, it's only 4 years, you have to study what led up to it, which means you have to study American history basically back to when the first guy set foot on Virginia shore, you know. And then to really understand the after effects, you have to study Reconstruction and everything all the way up to the modern era, because we're still paying the price for that war. So that expands that. Well, then you have to understand how all this ties into it, so you wind up studying European history, because that's where these attitudes basically start. And eventually you wind up studying the Peloponnesian War.
You had mentioned that your dad was a Mason and that your mom had talked to you several times about becoming a Mason. You finally joined the lodge when you were old enough, and did you get active in the lodge right away?
They actually didn't talk to me until I got out of the service.
Right.
Which I put my petition in almost immediately after that. As soon as I decided, my dad, my great-granddad, and Mr. Brad, and all these other guys that I'd known since I was just a wee pup, it was good enough for them, it was good enough for me. So I got out of the Army in July, and my petition was read in September at the next business meeting, because they didn't meet in the summertime. I was initiated in October. I was passed in November. They didn't do any degree work in December, so I was raised in January, and the week after that I was a steward and on the DeMolay board.
So you did get active right away?
Right away. There was no kidding around with it.
So when were you master?
I was master in 1986. I spent 4 years as a steward. Back in those days, we had competition for junior deacon, and the stewards all were expected. We had 4 elected stewards and 2 appointed stewards. The stewards were expected to run for junior deacon. If you didn't want to run for junior deacon, don't bother being a steward, because this is the way we do it. This is our pool. We get to see whether we like you or not. And typically the most senior steward, we didn't have senior and junior, it was just the pool. But the most senior steward was usually the one that got elected junior deacon. So I had to wait my turn like everybody else. And I got elected junior deacon the year my dad went out as master, which worked out pretty well. And then I became master in my own right. By that time, my dad was already in Grand Lodge. So I started out as master with, a false step, if you will, because we had a couple of guys that we installed as lodge. This year it's him, the next year it's him, and then it's back to him the year after that. I didn't do that, because as soon as my dad got involved running for Grand Lodge, I was involved. I was already going on committees and stuff. So I asked the Grand Master to install me, and I had the Grand Master and 5 of the other officers, including my dad, do my installation as master. So my dad was junior Grand Deacon. He acted as installing marshal. Bob Osborne, who was Grand Secretary, was installing Grand Secretary. Dick Sands was Grand Master. He installed me. And we had a couple other guys there. But the installing Grand Chaplain was my dad's ship's chaplain, who was also our vicar when we were kids from Windsor. So, and he turned out to be a Mason. So he came over and he acted. And that was the last time I ever saw him. He died not long after that, I think.
So you were installed as master in 86. Do you have any...
well, December of 85, technically.
86 you served. Yeah. Any great memories from that year? Some highlights?
I irritated a lot of past masters because I didn't follow their blueprint. Because my dad was already in Grand Lodge, he had strongly encouraged me to learn the Blue Book, which I was doing anyway from the time I was a steward. If you're going to be involved in something, you got to know the rules. So I knew what the rules were, and I knew what the rules weren't. So when you get somebody that comes by, you have to do it this way. It says I don't. Right there it says I don't. So no. And that ruffled some feathers, but I got through it. We had a pretty good year. I changed who did our meals. The one Eastern Star chapter wasn't happy with the way I wanted it done, so the other one hadn't had a fundraiser in years, so I had them do it, and I got a much better price. We went from $4.50 per reservation to $2 per head served, which is a big difference. The only thing was we had to go down and buy the food, so we went to Eastern Market every month because we had a dinner every month. And Jan and I and some friends of ours would go down to Eastern Market, and he had the contacts in Eastern Market. We'd buy the food every month and come back up, deliver it, and they'd cook it. And the other great thing was that the other group had kept all the leftovers, and I don't know whatever had to. This group didn't want the leftovers. We had the leftovers we could do with as we wished. So we could take them to a place in Royal Oak that it kind of shelters the runaway kids and give them really good food that they weren't, I mean, they were always so excited when you walk in the door because they're basically living on handouts, and we're bringing them in, you know, here, you want some chicken cordon bleu? Oh, yeah, you know, really excited about it. So that was a good thing. I like to think that we brought things up a little bit. With my dad being in Grand Lodge, you want to kind of sharpen your skills a little bit so that when people come to visit in a few years, when he's Grand Master, people are going to come to visit. You want to look sharp. So we worked on that. We got that going. We had a really good officer corps. I lost my junior deacon on Easter Sunday. He and his wife and a buddy of his and his wife were riding up, I think, Telegraph Road on their motorcycle, and somebody ran a red light and killed them, flat out dead. So I rotated my steward through the junior deacon's chair to see, let's decide which one we want next year, and give them a choice. Didn't quite work out the way I expected because a guy who was never there came in and got elected for it. But at least I showed him a different way of doing it.
So what appendant bodies do you belong to?
Oh, good Lord. Belong to Star. I've been patron there twice. I do not attend the meetings anymore. Jan does. Jan has been secretary for many years. She recently gave that up. But I belong to Star. I belong to Grotto. I was monarch there. The one I belong to longest is Scottish Rite. Well, Star, then Scottish Rite. I joined Scottish Rite in Spring Reunion in 1980. I joined Grotto in 86. Joined Royal Arch eventually. I joined the Shrine up in Marquette. I know there's more there because I pay a lot in dues.
I understand.
I actually have a list at home to keep track of what I have memberships in and what I've done every year because you just can't keep track of it. And you can't keep track of the committees at all. Even at Grand Lodge. I started serving committees in Grand Lodge in 1983 for the first parade committee. And my job in the first parade committee was cleaning up after the horses.
Great job.
And I got my sons to help me. They're like 5 and 6. And I'm driving one of the tractors from the home, pulling a trailer with a 5-gallon pail in it, and the boys running behind with shovels, scooping. That was their first introduction really to masonry too.
So, as a past Grand Master, you've received a lot of different honors and awards. What are a couple of the most memorable ones?
wide and varied. Of course, you know I've been elected to receive the 33rd degree this year, and that's a big honor, and I understand that. But when I was Grand Master, I did a deal at 5Fs, which is the kids' thing. Whoever brought the most prospective members could shave my head and paint it. And we brought a whole thing of different colored body paints or whatever. That wound up being 2 days after September 11th. So the whole attitude changed. We finally, the kids themselves, declared it a tie. So they all got to shave my head. And they painted my head in a big American flag. And I bent over like this so they could get a picture of this big American flag with square and compasses right on the forehead. And I drove home that way. But a while after that, I got a copy of that photo of me bending over like that. And it's an 8x10 photo. It's just my head with this American flag on it. And it said, I've got it hanging on my wall. Some people found their heroes on 9/11. We found ours on 9/13. That was cool. That was cool. Getting the Cross of Color from Rainbow was a surprise because I'm still not sure what I've done for that one. I'm not sure what I've done for 33rd. I got Knight Commander of the Temple from Knights Templar, and I'm not a member of Knights Templar. And I don't understand that one. I really don't understand that. I wasn't raised to expect things in return. I was raised to do the job, and your satisfaction for doing a job is having done the job. And that's the way I've lived my whole life. I've always thought it a bonus if I survived it, which I've managed to. I've survived a number of attempts on my life, and I figure that's an accomplishment right there. Just surviving all that stuff, that's my big honor and award. I'm still here. I'm beat up and I'm scarred, but I'm here. But I've gotten a lot of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the past Grand Masters that you knew that preceded you. Not necessarily the ones you served with, but even further back that you've met and had the opportunity to get to know.
I've worked in some way, shape, or form for every Grand Master since Russ Wells, who had that first parade. Knew Bob Sanborn, and Bob Sanborn is a gentleman. There's just no two ways around it. He's a gentleman's gentleman, and I love him to death. Royce Curlis was a trip. Royce was Grand Secretary back in those days. And Royce was Mr. Gruff. I mean, you talk about Billy Goat Gruff, that's Royce Curlis. And I rode the elevator with him one time when I was going to the office at Grand Rapids. I'm riding the elevator with him, and he's just all over me. And well, that turns out to just be the way Royce is. But Royce actually kind of liked the Cross boys. He would invite my dad and I up to visit Bethel Lodge, which was his lodge up in Sault Ste. Marie. And we'd get up there, and the arrangements were all made at the hotel and everything. And I can be a little bit contrary, and I know Royce is a little contrary, and it always amazed me that we got along as well as we wound up getting along. I just loved him to death. Holmes Swenson, who was a friend of my dad's, and I have Holmes Swenson's desk set on my desk at home today. Percy Williams. The first time I sat in a BGP meeting at Grand Lodge, I'm sitting next to this great tall drink of water next to me. And of course, I'm the young kid, and he's obviously been around a decade or two. And we're talking, and he, I'm mumbling to myself, as I tend to do. Well, what are they doing this for? Why are they doing this? And he's explaining it to me, and I really appreciated that. And after we're all done, I said, really pleased to meet you. I'm glad you took the time to talk to me. I'm Paul Cross. He says, I'm Percy Williams. I said, oh, great to meet you, Percy. About which time somebody comes up and says, oh, but Grandmaster Williams, or whatever. And it's like, oh, you're a past Grandmaster? Well, yeah, you know, but I mean, that doesn't really count, you know. And that's the way Percy was. I just loved him, too. Bob Osborne, who I worked with for 11 years when he was Grand Secretary. I assisted him in the East during the sessions for 11 years. When I was chairman of arrangements, I was doing arrangements and assisting Bob, running back and forth, doing both jobs. I was running the tape recorders when I was elected Grand Marshal. I was running the tape recorders when I was appointed as Grand Representative of Scotland, or actually Grand Representative of Scotland near Michigan, yeah. Bob was the greatest guy in the world. I just loved him to death. Did some leather work for Ice and May, too. God, I'm trying to think of the old guys. Vince Vader. Vince and I were very close, too. And I had Vince's past Grand Master's jewel until my dad died, and they offered me my dad's. So I took my dad's, which was Guy Powell's to begin with, and gave mine up. And mine and Vince's is now with Rick Ruland. Mike McPhee, and everybody called him Mike the Flea. He's a little bitty guy, but he's a great guy, big heart. My very good friend, Ron Schwartz. And I met Ron Schwartz. Jan's cousin, who had introduced us, was joining Lodge. And we went to Northland to see about getting him a ring for when he was raised. And we're talking to the guy at the jewelry counter. And this is 1970, I guess it's 79. And we're talking to the guy at the jewelry counter, and, oh, you're interested in Masonic rings. And he gets on, it turns out he's a Mason. When we're all done, he gives me his card. It's Ron Schwartz, and he had just gone out as Grand Master. And eventually our lodges consolidated, so we're members of the same lodge. I've got a picture on my iPad of Ron and I, him in his Boy Scout uniform, at Grand Lodge, me in my kilt, next to each other, and it is the long and the short of it, because Ron come up to about here.
Yeah, Ron was not tall
and
in
it was
stature.
the long and the short of it, and the joke was that here's little Ronnie the Boy Scout and his mama Paul with the kilts on. But Ron was a great guy. I just loved him to death. And he had something happen that he didn't come back to Grand Lodge. He didn't come to Lodge for a long time. So when I was Grand Master, I wanted to do something that would get him back in the fold without pushing him too hard. Because you don't catch flies with vinegar, you know. So I made him the chairman of Landmarks. I trusted his opinion. I made him chairman of Landmarks, and he started coming back eventually. And he stayed active and came back to Grand Lodge after that until he died.
For the benefit of the viewers, the Landmarks Committee of the Grand Lodge is a committee of all the past Grand Masters, and the Grand Master selects the chairman of that out of the past Grand Masters.
And when the Grand Master is doing something he's not sure is kosher, then he calls on the Landmarks Committee to tell him whether it's good or not.
So certainly your dad, and I would be willing to bet some of these other men were Masonic mentors to you. Did you have any other Masonic mentors along the way?
You know how bad I am with names. I'm trying to remember some of the names. Lots of guys. I traveled extensively because I was following my dad. Lots of guys whose faces I can see and whose names just I don't retain names very well.
I'm sure that a lot of the names that you mentioned.
There have been a lot of people that have taught me a little lesson. It seems like nothing at the time. But years later, when you're in a similar situation, that advice comes back. Certainly my dad, Rod Bedwell. I met Dave when I came down here because Rodney's boy was taking his degrees. I was already past master. I came down here and I was a senior deacon for Dave's Master Mason degree. I didn't know Dave from a hole in the wall, but I knew his dad, and his dad was one of those guys that you could count on to keep you straight. And whoa Nelly, a few years later, Dave and I are in line together, and he's my deputy Grand Master.
Yeah, I remember that.
And one of the other highlights of my Grand Master's year, I was installed by my father, and I believe I'm the only Grand Master of Michigan ever to have been installed by his father, because you have to be a past Grand Master or a Grand Master to install a Grand Master. And the only other father-son team was the Durans, William Duran and Charles Duran, and the father was dead some 20 years before the son became Grand Master. So my dad installed me, and the first thing I did when we got everybody installed and he turned it over to me was I presented him with his 50-year pin.
Yeah, I remember that. So let's go to your year as Grand Master. What are some of the highlights of your year?
We changed the installation in my year. We put it down in midday. We actually had to install before lunch because I had to be in Madrid for the World Conference. And Grand Lodge never ended before noon, so we're going to have to do it in the middle, and then I'll have to leave with the Grand Secretary, Don Boyer. Where did Boyer come from? Don and Joe and Jan and I have to leave for Madrid for the World Conference, which starts like just after we would get there. And we're in Traverse City. So I have to abandon my car and all of that luggage and stuff up in Traverse City, have someone drive it back to Detroit. We get the puddle jumper out, so we have to be gone quickly. So we set the installation up for like 11 o'clock or 11:30. We're going to install no frills pretty much, and then have a quick lunch, board meeting, and out. And I'd been going to Grand Lodge since 1983. It had never closed before noon on the second day. Bob Connolly got that Grand Lodge closed. Since that time, we've installed midday, and usually Grand Lodge is done by then. And it was nice to instill a change that continues. We got to Madrid, and we had to take 4 separate flights to get to Madrid. We took a flight from Traverse to Detroit, Detroit to either New York or Washington, D.C. Washington, because it was Dulles. We wound up. Then from Dulles to Heathrow, and then from Heathrow to Madrid. They lost every one of our bags. Well, we're supposed to go to dinner with the mayor of Madrid, who has more political clout than the president of Spain. But it's black tie affair. We're in our traveling clothes. That's all we've got. Dockers and a shirt. And, so everybody's trying to, is there a way that we can get these guys, tuxedos? And one of the other Grand Masters who was there, who's a little bitty fella, Ronnie Schwartz's size. I've got an extra tuxedo. You can borrow it. And I'm thinking, okay, what leg do I put it on? But the offer was very kind. We wound up having to miss the dinner, but that was okay. We went out and toured the city a little bit. And I gave my address to the World Conference the next day in the clothes I'd traveled in. Actually, no, I had stuffed up another pair of khakis and a button-down shirt in my duffel bag that I carried on. So at least they were clean, although badly wrinkled. And I gave my address to the World Conference on the Beacon Project. Not properly attired. Well, we were there for, I think, 3 days for that, and then we stayed for 3 more days. We changed hotels. We stayed for 3 more days. I think we changed hotels. And we just toured the city and saw what was going on. So we're in Madrid, and they're having this huge protest on this boulevard, one of the main streets, and they've got a tent city put up there, and they're having this big protest about free cell phones for everybody, And we're thinking, okay, this crowd's getting a little hairy. And we're walking down the street, we hear an explosion. And I'm looking around because this could be one of two things, right? Nobody's running around crazy or anything. So I'm thinking, I said to Don, I says, yeah, it really almost sounded like a signal gun as opposed to a proper explosion. So we kind of followed to where it was, and we hear the band playing and everything. We come to this compound that's got this like 12-foot block wall with razor wire on top. It's got these big wide doors on either end of the wall. So we go across the street, and they got the federal police that have the really cool uniforms and the funny little hats that are turned up in the back. Well, I like this stuff. I collect police memorabilia too. So we're watching the guy, and out comes this one door, the big door's open, and out comes this, it's a parade. These guys in military uniform. It turns out this is the Federal Military Academy. And they march out and down the sidewalk, drums all beating and everything else, and in the next gate. And that's it, because it's too dangerous. Well, I'm taking pictures, me and Don are taking pictures of the cop, because the uniform's cool. And he must have heard it. He's standing there with his hands behind his back, and he turns and he looks at us and comes up and goes, quick, put the cameras in the pocket, do like this, because we got visions now of being in some inquisitorial dungeon, and we got out of there before he changed his mind. But that was pretty cool. And we spent some time in Madrid. It was really kind of neat.
Great experience.
It's nice to get out in the city away from the tourist areas, because if you're going to stay in the tourist area, you don't really see the country, right? So you go to the restaurants where you better figure out Spanish, you know?
Let's move on, and I want to ask you a couple of questions as we start to close this. The first question is, what would you tell somebody that said they were thinking about joining the Masonic fraternity? What advice would you give them?
First, I'd have them shop for a lodge, because not every lodge is the same. Obviously, it's a good organization. I've enjoyed it. I've been a member for 35 years, I think now. I've enjoyed it immensely. My father enjoyed it immensely. Trying to be difficult because not every city where he's stationed is receptive to outsiders. And that's a problem we have with a lot of lodges. They don't know you. They're not necessarily comfortable with you. But I would say shop for the lodge. Find a lodge that's doing the stuff that you want them to do. They should have social events. They should have fun events. It should not all be meetings and ritual. Because who needs, I mean, that's how we make Masons, that's how we run our business, but it's not what it's about. It's a social fraternity. We should do social things. Keep the family involved.
What advice would you give to somebody that was about to become Worshipful Master?
Ignore the past masters, first and foremost, and that includes past grandmasters, because they have a tendency to think about the way it was in their day and think that that's the only way it can or should be. Keep an open mind. Know the Blue Book. You should never, ever, as master, have to ask somebody else, is this allowed in the Blue Book? You should know it. If you want to ask the way they look at what's in the Blue Book, that's okay. It's good to seek advice, but you should know what it says already. Don't be afraid to change things. Some of the things I've discovered with working with different lodges is there's no rule that the stewards or the deacons have a staff. But by God, there's some past masters that'll tell you that's in the book. There's no rule that says you cannot wear a hat in lodge. It's not prohibited. It's not standard in Western culture, but it's not prohibited. The master's not even required to wear a hat. He should wear a hat that's appropriate to the attire of the office. So if you go to an outdoor degree and you're wearing your ball cap because the sun's bright and you're trying to keep from going blind, and some old past master says, take that hat off, you're in lodge, you can tell him, show me in the Blue Book, because you know what he did. Basically, know your job before you take it on, like any other job. Know what you're getting into before you get into it, so that You don't have to be led around by the nose by somebody else who might be leading you astray, because if he leads you astray, he doesn't pay the price. The master does.
That's true. What would you tell somebody that came to you and said, I'm thinking about running for Grand Lodge?
See a psychiatrist. Know what you're getting into. The only requirement we have is that you're a past master, and I'm sorry, that's not sufficient. You should have spent a number of years working in Grand Lodge in some capacity. Committees is where I got my start. I never was a BGP or a DDI, but I worked on the parade committee, speakers bureau, juvenile diabetes committee. I was chairman of most of those committees at one point for years. Of course, I had the advantage of following my dad also. Study the blue book. You can't know how to be the boss if you don't know what the rule book is. Read Mackey's Officer's Handbook that used to come out. We don't see a lot. It's not gospel, but it gives you little hints. Read as much as you can about being master, but know our rules, because every state's different. Every lodge has different things they'll expect of it. But you really need to, if you're going to be Grand Master, you need to be well founded. You have to remember one thing. The minute you get elected to Grand Lodge, your lodge is no longer priority. Your district is no longer priority. Your region of the state is no longer a priority. I belong in Southeast Michigan. My lodge is Berkley. But as Grand Master, I have to be as concerned about what's affecting the lodges down here as I do about Ironwood. And if there's legislation that comes up that is great for Southeast Michigan, but hurts the UP, it's bad legislation. I don't care if it helps down here, it's hurting up there. And the rules should never hurt anybody who's doing it right. You know, if we set rules to keep people from doing things wrong, that's one thing. But you have to be conscious of the needs of every single lodge in the state. And the only way you can do that is to get to every corner of the state and learn what's going on and find people there who get comfortable enough with you, who think enough of you as a person, as an individual, that they'll call you and talk to you. And you can call them and ask, hey, this has come up. What do you think about it up in your neck of the woods? And always be aware his opinion may not be everyone else's.
That's it. We've got about a minute left, and I'd like to ask you the final question. And it's probably going to be hard to answer in less than 60 seconds, but how has Masonry impacted your life?
When I joined Lodge, I was a shy, quiet, and retiring individual. Yes, I was a military guy. I was a machine gunner, a squad leader, and in that capacity I worked. But I was a non-confrontational, shy, quiet guy who wouldn't say boo to a ghost. You can't do that if you're active in Freemasonry. You have to learn to talk to people, especially if you're following your dad all over the state and you got to wait 2 hours while he talks to people. You eventually have to come out of that far corner of the dining room and talk to somebody else. So it really brought me out of my shell. It helped me immensely in the police department because you learn to step back a little bit and take a look at that guy's situation. Now, am I still going to arrest you? Yes, I'm still going to arrest you. But I can be a gentleman about it as long as you're willing to be a gentleman and not resist me. If you resist me, it's game on. But as soon as you're handcuffed, game's over. I don't have to treat you bad just because you're a prisoner. I can still treat you as a decent person just because you made a mistake. You know, Masonry helped me a lot in that.
I want to say one thing about something that you taught me when I first went into Grand Lodge. You were the Deputy Grand Master when I became Grand Marshal. And the very first lodge I ever visited was Golden Ark, and you were visiting the lodge as well. It was the first initiation of 19-year-olds in the state of Michigan. And the lesson I learned from you that day is they came to you and they were all concerned because Grand Lodge officers were there. And the first question they asked is, what do we call you? And you said, Brother Paul. And I always remembered that, and I always used that line. Of course, I said Brother Walt. But you learned me a valuable lesson on there. Paul, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us in the Legacy Series. We appreciate your coming down and sharing your story with us. And
been my pleasure, Walt. Thank you.
Yep.